What if all languages merged into one? It begins with a word that feels slightly wrong. You are in the middle of a conversation, nothing important, just a normal exchange, when the person in front of you says something. And for a moment, it does not sound like the language you know, but you understand it perfectly, not because you recognize the words, but because meaning arrives instantly, without translation, without effort, without thought. You pause, try to process what just happened. The sound was unfamiliar, the structure was different, and yet you knew exactly what it meant. You respond, and the moment you speak, you notice it. Your voice sounds different, not in tone, not in pitch, but in language. The words you say are not the ones you expected, but they are understood immediately by the other person, without confusion, without hesitation. Across the world, the same moment unfolds. People begin to speak, and something shifts. The sounds change, the patterns of speech evolve, words blend, restructure, reform into something that no longer belongs to any single language. At first, it is subtle, a sentence that feels slightly different, a phrase that sounds unfamiliar, but still understandable. Then it accelerates. Languages begin to merge, not gradually over generations, but instantly, globally. Every word spoken carries elements of multiple languages at once. Grammar reshapes itself in real time. Sounds blend into new forms that should not work together but somehow do. And the most important part, everyone understands. No matter where they are, no matter what they spoke before, meaning becomes universal, immediate, complete. At first, confusion spreads. Not because people cannot communicate, but because communication feels different. You hear something new, but you know it. You speak something unfamiliar, but it is correct. It feels like learning and remembering at the same time. At the same time, something deeper begins to happen. Translation disappears, not as a tool, but as a concept. You no longer need to convert meaning from one language to another. There is no gap, no delay, no interpretation. Everything is direct, and that changes something fundamental, because language was never just about meaning. It was about structure, identity, culture. At the same time, something unexpected begins to emerge. Barriers fall. Instantly, people who could not communicate before now speak freely. Conversations happen across borders without effort, without misunderstanding, without limitation. Business changes, travel changes, interaction changes. The world feels smaller, closer, more connected, but something else begins to fade. Difference, because language carried uniqueness. It shaped how people thought, how they expressed ideas, how they understood the world. And now, that uniqueness begins to dissolve. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect memory. People start forgetting their original languages. Not completely at first, but gradually. Words disappear, structures fade. The way you used to speak becomes harder to recall, replaced by something new, something universal. And that creates a strange feeling, because language was part of who you were. And now that part is changing. At the same time, something unexpected begins to happen. Thinking shifts, because language is not just how you speak, it is how you think. And as language merges, thought patterns begin to merge as well. People start thinking in the same structures, the same logic, the same flow of ideas. Differences in expression begin to narrow, not completely, but noticeably. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect culture. Stories change, traditions change, because language carried history, meaning, context that could not always be translated. Now everything is understood, but not everything feels the same, because some meanings were tied to the way they were said. And when the way changes, the feeling changes too. At the same time, something else begins to emerge. Efficiency. Communication becomes faster, cleaner, more direct. There is no confusion. No misinterpretación. No delay. And that creates a new kind of interaction. Precise, clear, immediate. But something is missing. At the same time, something deeper begins to shift. Emotion in language becomes flatter, not absent, but less varied, because emotional expression was shaped by linguistic nuance. Tone, structure, cultural context. Now, those differences are reduced, unified, and that changes how people express what they feel. At the same time, something unexpected begins to happen. Silence becomes more noticeable, because when everything is understood, there is less need to explain, less need to clarify, less need to repeat. Communication becomes shorter, more efficient, but also less layered. As the first day comes to an end, as the world adjusts to a reality where everyone speaks the same language, one realization begins to settle. This is not just about understanding each other. It is about becoming more similar, because language was not just a tool, it was a boundary, a way to create difference, and without it, that difference begins to fade. Because when everyone speaks the same way, the question is no longer whether you understand someone. It becomes, what makes you different from them? It does not stay neutral. At first, the world celebrates the clarity. No misunderstandings, no translation errors, no lost meaning between people. Communication becomes immediate, precise, almost perfect in its efficiency. But efficiency changes more than speed. It changes depth. Because language was never just about being understood. It was about how meaning was shaped. And now that shaping becomes uniform. At the same time, something deeper begins to happen. Differences in thinking start to narrow. Not completely, but noticeably. People begin to approach problems in similar ways, not because they agree, but because the structure of their thoughts begins to align. The same patterns repeat across cultures that were once distinct. Arguments sound familiar. Ideas form in similar ways. Conclusions begin to overlap. And that creates something unexpected. Agreement becomes easier, but originality becomes harder. At the same time, something else begins to fade. Cultural distance. Not physical distance, but conceptual. Because language carried unique ways of seeing the world. Certain ideas existed only within specific languages, shaped by words that had no exact equivalent anywhere else. Now, everything is expressed in one system, and in that system, some meanings cannot fully survive. They are translated, simplified, adjusted, until they fit, and in that process something is lost. Not the idea, but its depth. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect memory. People try to recall old phrases, old expressions, the way something used to sound, but it feels distant, incomplete, as if it belongs to a different version of reality. A version that no longer exists, and that creates a quiet loss. Not visible, but constant, because language was tied to history, to identity, to the way people connected to their past. Now that connection weakens. At the same time, something unexpected begins to emerge. Silence becomes more powerful, because when everyone understands everything instantly, words lose some of their necessity. Conversations become shorter, more direct, less layered. There is less need to explain, less need to repeat, less need to clarify, and that efficiency removes something, the process of discovering meaning together. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect emotion. Expression becomes more controlled, more standardized, because emotional nuance was carried through language, through the way something was said, through structures that allowed feelings to expand, to shift, to exist in different forms. Now, those forms are limited, unified, and while people still feel deeply, they express it in similar ways. And that similarity creates distance, not between people, but between emotion and expression. At the same time, something else begins to happen. Power shifts. not in the usual way, but through understanding. Before, language could create advantage. Those who controlled communication could influence perception. Now that control disappears because everyone understands everything equally, and that creates a more balanced system, but also a more exposed one, because nothing can be hidden behind complexity. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect creativity. First, it expands, because ideas can be shared instantly across the world. But then it stabilizes, because everyone is working within the same structure, the same patterns, the same forms, and without variation, creativity begins to converge, not disappear, but align. At the same time, something unexpected begins to be missed. Misunderstanding, not the confusion, but the process, the effort of trying to understand someone who thinks differently. The moments where meaning is unclear, where interpretation is required, where communication becomes exploration. Now that process is gone. Everything is clear, but clarity removes discovery. At the same time, something deeper begins to affect identity. People begin to feel more similar, not physically, not completely, but in expression, because language was one of the strongest ways to define difference. And without it, that difference becomes harder to maintain. You can still think differently, but you express it in the same system as everyone else. And over time, that system shapes the thought itself. As months pass, the world stabilizes again. Communication becomes smooth, efficient, global, but something remains. A subtle sense that something has been reduced, not lost entirely, but simplified, because language was not just about connecting people. It was about separating them, creating boundaries that allowed uniqueness to exist. And without those boundaries, the world becomes more connected, but also more uniform. In the end, a final realization begins to settle. Understanding everyone does not make people the same, but it removes the barriers that made them feel different. And without those barriers, difference must come from somewhere else. Because when everyone speaks the same language, what defines you is no longer how you say something, but whether what you say is truly your own.